Welcome back to 10-Minute Timelines. In this episode, we will cover the Cold War. As we dive into the annals of history, we find ourselves at the end of World War II, a time of both relief and apprehension. With the fall of the Axis powers, the world breathed a sigh of relief. However, the vacuum left by the defeated powers soon became a breeding ground for a new kind of conflict. The world stage was now dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, both basking in the glory of their victory, yet deeply divided by ideology. The United States, the champion of capitalism, believed in a world driven by free markets and individual liberties. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, a stronghold of communism, advocated for a state-controlled economy and society. These stark ideological differences were not just theoretical debates confined to political circles. They began to permeate every facet of international relations, leading to an increasing polarization of the world. Nations were pressured to align themselves with either of the superpowers, often leading to internal conflicts and even civil wars in several regions. In this climate of escalating tensions, a term began to gain currency: Cold War. But what does it mean? The Cold War, as it came to be known, was not a traditional war marked by direct military confrontations between the two superpowers. Instead, it was a state of political and military tension, a chess game played on a global scale, where the moves were made not with soldiers, but with political maneuvers, economic pressures, and threats of nuclear warfare. The stakes were incredibly high. Both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons, and the fear of a full-scale nuclear war was a constant companion to the world during this period. The palpable tension, the constant jostling for power, and the looming threat of nuclear annihilation defined the Cold War era. And thus, the stage was set for a conflict that would span decades, pushing the world to the edge of nuclear catastrophe. The early years of the Cold War were marked by a series of political maneuvers and proxy wars. This was an era where tension simmered and the world held its breath, watching as two superpowers danced on the precipice of conflict. In the late 40s, President Truman of the United States set forth a doctrine that would shape American foreign policy for decades to come. The Truman Doctrine, as it came to be known, was a commitment to support free peoples resisting subjugation, a direct response to the threat of communist expansion. Around the same time, Europe was reeling from the devastation of the Second World War. Enter the Marshall Plan, a bold initiative to aid European recovery. Named after Secretary of State George Marshall, this plan was an economic lifeline, a beacon of hope amid the ruins. But it was also a strategic move to prevent the spread of communism in war-torn Europe. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949 saw the Soviet Union attempt to wrest control of the city by cutting off all access routes. In response, the Allies launched the Berlin Airlift, supplying the isolated city by air for almost a year, a poignant symbol of resistance. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed. This military alliance of Western nations was a clear signal to the Soviet Union. An attack on one was an attack on all. The early years also saw the first major armed conflict of the Cold War, the Korean War. From 1950 to 1953, North and South Korea became the battleground for a war fought by proxy, with the United States and its allies supporting South Korea, and China and the Soviet Union backing the North. These were the years of fear and suspicion, an atmosphere so thick you could cut it with a knife. The world was a chessboard, and the players were not just countries, but ideologies. As the 1950s ended, the Cold War was about to enter an even more dangerous phase. With the world watching in trepidation, the 60s and 70s saw the Cold War reach its zenith. The Berlin Wall, a chilling symbol of division and conflict, was erected in 1961, effectively splitting Germany into two distinct entities. This, however, was just the beginning of an era marked by heightened tensions and riveting global events. The Cuban Missile Crisis soon followed in 1962, an intense 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over the installation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The world held its breath as it teetered on the brink of nuclear war, a chilling reminder of the destructive potential of this global standoff. The Vietnam War also played a significant role in Cold War dynamics. The United States' involvement in Vietnam primarily from 1965 to 1973, was seen as a direct attempt to contain the spread of communism. This controversial war sparked widespread anti-war sentiments, with protests erupting across the globe. The space race, too, was a critical component of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union vied for supremacy in space exploration, a competition that culminated in the United States landing the first man on the moon in 1969. This marked a significant victory for the US, symbolizing their technological and ideological superiority. The 70s, however, began to see a slight easing of tensions, a period known as détente. This included a series of agreements on arms control and increased diplomatic dialogue. But this was not to last. However, just when it seemed like the Cold War might be thawing, events in Afghanistan reignited the tensions. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was viewed as a stark violation of international law, sparking an international outcry and setting the stage for the final chapters of the Cold War. The final decade of the Cold War saw a dramatic shift in the balance of power. The Soviet Union, once a formidable adversary, began to show signs of internal strain. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a significant turning point. The Soviets found themselves embroiled in a costly and protracted conflict, often referred to as their Vietnam War. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Reagan Doctrine was taking shape. Reagan, a staunch anti-communist, pledged to confront the Soviet Union not only through deterrence, but also by actively supporting anti-communist movements worldwide. This policy further drained the Soviet resources and willpower. Amid these geopolitical tensions, the Soviet Union faced a domestic crisis. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster sent shockwaves throughout the country, revealing the deep-seated issues within the Soviet system. The incident was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and secrecy, and it severely damaged the Soviet Union's international reputation. In response to these challenges, Mikhail Gorbachev, who came into power in 1985, introduced two revolutionary policies: glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. Glasnost allowed for greater freedom of speech and transparency in government, while perestroika aimed to reform the Soviet Union's stagnant economy. These policies, however, were met with resistance and failed to halt the country's decline. The most symbolic event of this period was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. For nearly 30 years, the wall had been a physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain that divided East and West. Its destruction marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union and the Cold War. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its economic and political crises. The once mighty superpower was dissolved, and 15 independent countries emerged from its ashes. The Cold War, a conflict that had kept the world on edge for over 4 decades, had finally come to an end. In the aftermath, the United States stood as the sole superpower, marking the start of a new era in international relations. The Cold War shaped the world in ways that are still felt today. Its conclusion marked the end of the bipolar world order that had defined international relations for nearly half a century. The Soviet Union disintegrated, leaving the United States as the sole superpower, dominating global politics and economics. The balance of power was drastically shifted, and the world was no longer divided into two opposing blocs. The geopolitical landscape underwent significant changes. Newly independent states emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union, each grappling with its own set of challenges. Eastern Europe, once held firm under the grip of communism, began a journey towards democracy and market economies. The post-Cold War era also saw the rise of new powerhouses like China and India, further reshaping the global order. But the impact of the Cold War was not confined to geopolitical shifts. It permeated into the fabric of societies, influencing culture, technology, and ideology. The race to space, the fear of nuclear annihilation, the ideological battle between capitalism and communism, these aspects of the Cold War era still echo in our times. In essence, the Cold War era, a time of tension and transformation, continues to shape our world. Its legacy can be seen in the political, economic, and social structures that govern our lives today. It serves as a stark reminder of the power of ideology and the potential consequences of global conflict. The Cold War involved a series of events that have profoundly influenced the world we live in today. We've explored everything from its dawn to aftermath, traversing through the early years, the height, and the endgame. It's clear that these events have left an indelible mark on our global landscape. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Cold War. If you found this video informative and engaging, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more 10-minute timelines.